All right. Once again, thanks for joining our webinar today, getting started with BigQuery and GA4. We'll go ahead and jump right on in. If you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, Luca. All right, just a little bit of housekeeping items for today. If you could all, you're all should be muted. Wanted to let everyone know that you're welcome to ask questions throughout the webinar. There is a question box where you can type in your answers, and we've got, or I'm sorry, type in your questions, and we've got a few of our experts here at AdSwerve taking a look at those questions and providing answers throughout the webinar. We'll also have a Q&A at the end. So as Luca presents his material, as you think of questions, you're welcome to save those for the end for Luca. We will be sending the webinar out after it concludes. So the recording will be coming to you all that attended via email. So be on the lookout for that in the next day or two. And with that, we will go ahead and get started. So just a little bit more about AdSwerve. We are the leading Google Analytics partner. We have successfully helped 100+ clients with GA4 implementations. And we have 50+ analytics experts and cloud experts on our team. And we are just here to help anyone who has questions about GA4 and BigQuery. We have lots of information on our blog. We have various webinars and resources available to you. So go ahead and take a look at those when you have a minute. And go ahead and go to the next slide. Thank you. Want to introduce Luca Kempre to everyone, our senior data scientist here at AdSwerve. He will be taking you through today's webinar and showing you some live queries. So we're excited to have Luca today and appreciate all of you joining us. And without further ado, Luca. Hey, Luca, I think you're on mute.
There we go. Hope you can hear me now.
We can. Thank you.
Oh, perfect. Thank you for the intro. And yeah, thank you everyone for joining. So this will be the agenda for today. We'll start with connecting Google Analytics 4 and BigQuery. And this has already been discussed in a previous webinar about a year ago in more detail. So if you have more questions about that, there's more resources that we have. I will go through it very quickly so that we can start diving into the schema. And then most of the webinar, hopefully we can dedicate to writing the queries. I have about 6 or 7 queries that we'll go through, starting from very simple metrics and trying to get a match between your data in BigQuery and what you see in Google Analytics UI. And then we'll do a few more advanced queries that may not be possible to be executed in the UI. And then, as Marie mentioned, if you have any questions, feel free to post them as I'm talking. We have a few employees on the line that will help you answer those. And then we have some time set up at the end for that as well. So to just dive right in and go into the connecting Google Analytics 4 to BigQuery. So it's just a little bit of description of what BigQuery is. BigQuery is a service within Google Cloud Platform. It's a very fast data warehouse that allows you to store structured data and then also to run queries. Outside of that, you can also run machine learning algorithms on your data within BigQuery itself. It allows you to bring in your own data. So if you're using a CRM and you want to join that data with Google Analytics, for example, you can definitely do that. The queries that you can run are blazing fast. We're running gigabyte, sometimes terabyte queries within seconds. The export itself from Google Analytics 4 to BigQuery is free for all and available to all. Now, this is a big upgrade from the Universal Analytics or Google Analytics 3, because now even the standard version, the non-paid, the free version of Google Analytics offers that export. So the export itself is free. There may be a cost associated with storage and processing. There are free tiers in BigQuery as well, so it's very possible that if you have a smaller website, the storage and the processing and the export to BigQuery could all be free. Having data in BigQuery allows you to basically own your data. From there, you have that log level events, every single event that gets executed and sent to Google Analytics, along with some of the system events like session start and first visit that get kind of syntactically created. They all end up in BigQuery as events. And from there, you can export it and house it in your own platform, or you can go ahead and start executing queries and maybe even go into ML within the BigQuery itself. The data will include all the events, even the so-called cookieless pings. So Google Analytics 4 allows for some privacy options, consent mode. You can anonymize some of the events. Those events will end up in BigQuery as well. Of course, the user ID, user pseudo ID as it's called, will be redacted. And it has a really, really good real-time export. So what we're seeing with a lot of our properties is that data in BigQuery is available within seconds of those events getting fired on the website itself. So just a quick intro into what the export is, what BigQuery is, how quickly the data becomes available. Here's now how to turn it on. So within your Google Analytics 4 UI, you go under the admin section, and in product linking, there are quite a few products now available. You'll find BigQuery links. I believe now it's under Google Ads and Ad Manager links. And once you click on that, if you have not linked Google Analytics 4 to your Google Cloud project before, you won't see any projects on the list yet, and you'll just select link. After that, it's going to ask you to select an existing BigQuery project. So if you have a Google Cloud project already, you can select an existing one, or you can create a new one for this specific purpose. Often we get asked, what if you have multiple GA4 properties? Can they all go into the same BigQuery project? Of course. So BigQuery, Google Cloud Platform, is a standalone product. In Google Analytics, you're just selecting which project you want your data exported to. So if you want them side by side, definitely select one project for all your properties. But at the same time, you can also have some sort of separation. Maybe different properties are meant for different teams and you want to handle access on a project level. You can definitely export different properties to different projects. So once you're in there, like I said, you'll select your project or create a new one, and then you'll select where you want your data to be located. So those are BigQuery regions. This has a lot to do with privacy laws. So for example, usually in European Union, data collected in there, you may want it to stay within EU. So if you select EU dataset, EU location, all the data coming from Google Analytics will end up in EU dataset. So basically physical servers located within European Union. On the next step, you'll select what data streams you want to have exported. If you want advertising identifiers for mobile app streams included, and then the frequency. So I definitely suggest selecting daily and streaming export so that you have that finalized data from your Google Analytics in your daily exports, but at the same time, you can access streaming data and see what's happening on your website today. And like I mentioned earlier, sometimes even within seconds. One note here is that streaming is an additional cost for on a BigQuery site. So just importing data in batch for a daily export to BigQuery is a free process in the Google Cloud. Streaming data has a certain cost associated. And that would be a few cents per gigabyte of data imported. So just quick takeaways. We looked at what BigQuery is, how to turn on the GA4 to BigQuery export, and what to select, what's a Google Cloud project. So once your data is in BigQuery, the first thing you'll notice is where it's located, what the schema is like. So let's dive into that a little bit before we start looking into some more simple queries. There's going to be a new data set created, and it'll be in a format of analytics_property ID. So I'll start sharing my BigQuery project just to get a sense of what that looks like. So at the top here, you'll see I have a project selected, and this project is displayed here on the left side of my BigQuery workspace. And then the only data set that I have in here is the analytics underscore and a number. So this number is the exact property ID of the Google Analytics 4 property that I'm exporting. One thing that we usually suggest is you can add details, maybe add a description, just so if you don't recognize them all by the numeric ID, that you know what property you're working with. I know if you work with it a lot, you'll probably know which one's which, but add details and you can add a description and know exactly which property you're exporting. Another question that we also get quite often is, can this be changed? Can the data set itself have a different name? And the answer to that is probably not. And the reason is that Google Analytics creates this and is expecting this to be there so that it can import tables into it, probably because you could copy the data into your own data set, but we definitely don't suggest duplicating data and having it in two places. So if you can just use the data set as it is, it's going to make things a lot easier, and add a description to it. So in the tables that we have now, you will see we have events and event intraday tables. Event tables will be exports for the previous day. Now in this case, I copied our AdSwerve data into a clean project so that I don't expose everything else. You see we have data for June 26th. At this time today, so June 29th in the morning, we would generally expect to have data for the previous day in here already. And then we have the events intraday. This is where data will be streamed. The schema is identical. Just a few fields semantically may not get populated yet. So I believe traffic source is not populated yet. And before events table gets finalized, it's possible that there's going to be a few changes from what you may see in the same day streaming table. So yes, we went through the daily tables, streaming tables. Let's look at the rows and do a little preview of the data. So each row now compared to Google Analytics 3 or Universal Analytics is already an event. So if you want to work with events, there's no need to flatten or unnest your data. And if we go to the right, a lot of dimensions you'll remember are similar, but there are quite a few new ones as well. And I'll dive into that in the next slide. But just high level to remember, each row now is an event, and you can see it's at the beginning here, at least we got event timestamp, so epoch time of when the event occurred, and the name of the event. And some members of our team like to have fun and create events with emojis. And those, interestingly, do come all the way through to BigQuery and can be used in your queries. It's fun like that. And I do have a quick overview of the schema as well. There's a lot less repeated fields, and there's no multi-level nesting like you were used to before. So in the past for Google Analytics 3, you could go from a session level row that had nested hits, and those hit had nested products, and that product had nested custom dimensions. So there's a lot less of that nesting happening. We'll still look into it, but specifically event parameters and user parameters are the two fields that we'll look into. Schema, a couple of things I already showed, But to dive into it a bit more, so we have a user pseudo ID. That's the identifier of the user as the Google Analytics sees it. So in the old Google Analytics, that was a client ID. When you go to a website, that would be the _GA cookie, at least the second part of the _GA cookie. Then we got a lot of event information. So when did the event occur, event date, timestamp of the event. Interestingly, we also have a user's first touch timestamp, and we'll dive into that a little bit later. But this is an important field because if we're looking at the events today, we also see when that user first came to our website or an application, and that could have happened years ago. So there is a lot of optimization on some of the queries that we can do, and it would be like looking at when did someone's journey begin. That data is directly provided along with traffic source, which the basic traffic source values now signify the user's initial acquisition channel. Then we have the event name. So event name, since in Google Analytics for everything's an event, will include very custom event names as well as some of the default event names like page view, scroll, and then what I'm calling here system created events. So session start and first visit would be two of those. And we'll use some of these in the queries later on. First visit, for example, in the past was an attribute that showed us totals.new visits. Now it's an actual event that gets sent with users first visit. Then we have the event parameters. That's the repeated or nested field that includes keys and values. Same for user properties. We have user lifetime value in there that gets generated by GA4. Device, geo, traffic source info, that's very similar. And then we have e-commerce, a lot of e-commerce fields and items that pertains to e-commerce. So schema comparison between Google Analytics 3 and Google Analytics 4. This is how it changed. So in GA3, you can see when we look at the repeated fields and we try to go from that one big table that we have in BigQuery's nested schema and split them out, it was session, hits, then we had custom dimensions, we had experiments that could be multiple on each hit, multiple promotions on each hit. So as soon as you were able to have multiple things on a hit or multiple custom dimensions on a product, we had these nestings. This is now a little bit simplified. So I would say event here is at a center, and then for each event, you can have user properties that are repeated field, event parameters, and items. So there could be multiple items associated with each event. But just a quick overview of how the schema changed. Again, the most important change that I see is that we went from session scope, so each row is a session, to event scope default table. So now when we want to work with sessions, we have to do a few things beforehand. And in Google Analytics 3 export, if we wanted to work with hits, we had to flatten or unnest the table first. As I'll be going through the examples, I'll be using our website's data, so adswerk.com. If you want to replicate what I'm doing, if you already have a Google Cloud project, you can just start writing queries using the publicly available data sets. So there are two, one's for e-commerce web and one's for a gaming app. If you don't have a project yet, you can also create one very quickly on Google Cloud, and I believe you will also get a considerable trial amount of cash to use. But as said, there is a free tier for BigQuery, so I believe you can have quite a few gigabytes of storage, up to terabyte of processing before you even get charged anything. And yeah, now let's dive in. So let's start with something very simple. I pulled this from our website. We had 978 users and 11,000 events on June 23rd. Now let's say we want to get to those same numbers in BigQuery. How would we do that? So I'll go into my BigQuery. I'll go under events. And we were working with June 23rd. The easiest way to get some sort of a template query created in BigQuery is instead of opening a new tab and writing from scratch, if you open your table and then in your table you click query, and we can do this in new tab, you'll see it constructs this frame for you already. And in this case, it's looking at June 26th. So each table is its own day. It's pretty easy to query across multiple tables. We could use a wildcard, and this would, for example, select all the tables and allow us to query everything in June of 2022. I'll make it a little bigger, but in our case, we're looking at June 23rd. So I'll select June 23rd. And let's see, we were looking at users and events. So as I mentioned, every row is an event. So if we just do count star, this could be our events, and I'll run this very quickly here. 11,133 events. If I go back here, we'll see that the number matches, and now let's see users, 978. One thing to note here is that if you'll dive into the documentation, you'll see that some of the session numbers, some of the user numbers are very good estimates in Google Analytics 4. So you may not get the exact match, but you should usually expect to be within 1% of 2 of the numbers that you're seeing in Google Analytics. So let's look into how to query for user. So user pseudo ID is that identifier that we have. Let's find it in the schema here. And you can see if you're used to a client ID from Google Analytics 3, or if you've ever looked at the Google Analytics cookie _GA on your website, you'll see that it looks the same. So I'll grab the user pseudo ID, and if we look at the distinct count of user pseudo ID, this should give us the number of users, 979. And like I said, there could be a slight discrepancy, and we're seeing we're off by 1. I have all the queries available in here in the slide deck as well, and the slide deck will be shared after the presentation. So along with the slide deck, I have included all of the queries as well. So if you can't follow us quickly, or if you're more just listening right now, don't worry, this will all be shared. And now let's look into using some automatically collected events to get additional metrics out of our BigQuery data. So let's specifically look at session starts and first visits. So session start event will let us know how many sessions were started. First visit looks at the new users. And in this case, those two show up under the attribute event name. You can see under event name here we have first visit, session start, we got page views, we have audience, someone on our team is sending emojis. So let's do event name, and to get number of sessions, it's as simple as looking for event names that start with session start, and those would be how many sessions started on that day. And if we look at the event name equals first visit, that would be the number of users. So I'll run these two. And there we go. Let's see the number. Oh, so let's rename this one to the number of new users. I'm running it perfect. So just a quick simple check is always good. So you would expect to see more sessions than users. It looks like on our website, when looking at a day, each user on average has about, 1.2 sessions. That makes perfect sense. For each session, we're seeing about 10 events, and we should see less new users than total users, and we are. So about maybe 80% of all the users are new users in our case. So just a simple start without any deeper dive into the event parameters. Without flattening, you can already start accessing quite a few fields. And in this case, compared to Google Analytics 3, you can start working without flattening, without unnesting on events data, because again, these tables are scoped on the event. I'll uncover this one, and you can see we wrote pretty much the same query this time. Now, because we were working with the session start event, sometimes we may want to ask ourselves, right, what session does this page view belong to? So this page view is completely independent row. It's not part of a parent that would be a session like we saw in Google Analytics 3, where all the hits were nested within a session. So we need to construct that session ID so that we can start grouping our events into sessions, because that may be a useful query. So we had first visit, we got session start, we got page view. For each page view, if you scroll to the right, we have user pseudo ID, but we don't have a session identifier. Session identifiers are hiding within event parameters. So if I open event parameters, in there you'll see that we have a Google Analytics session ID. We also have a Google Analytics session number to know which session of that user we're working with. Is it a first, second, third session of a user? But if we want to construct our Google Analytics session ID, we'll first have to unnest the event parameters. And we can do that pretty quickly on the fly. So I'll just go back to our query here. And let's, for each hit, first start with selecting our session ID. So session ID is an integer within the event parameters. If we look into schema, you'll see we have event params, we have key and value, and then within value, it can be a string, integer, float, or double value. So depending on what type of data Google Analytics is sending us, if it's a string, it will be in the string. If it's a number, it'll be in the integer value. The session ID is created as a number, so we'll find it here under value, integer value. And for the key, we will use GA underscore session underscore ID. So to get to it, we'll select the integer value from, and this is the part where there's a little bit of a learning curve. If you're just using standard SQL and let's say MySQL, and you start using BigQuery and you start working with these nested fields, so this unnest will make that repeated field within our event open up and allow us to access, in this case, an individual value from the key GA session ID. So I'll say event parameters here because that's the name of our field. And then within event parameters field, I'm already grabbing the value, int value, and I only want to do that for my key of GA session ID. So I'll say key equals GA underscore session ID, and I'll call this session ID. And it looks like I had an error. Give me 1 second. Okay, yeah, I forgot the where clause. There we go. So where key equals GA session ID. And you can see we still have 11,133 events like we counted before. And for each event, now we have a session ID. Session ID is not unique for the property. It will be unique for each user. As you can see, it's just a time of when the session started. So to get the actual session ID, we'll want to concatenate our session ID with a user pseudo ID. And that will give us a session ID that we can use for this specific property. So I'll remove this one. You can see I have the formula written out here as well. So one thing that I'm that I was looking at here in the screenshot as well is just showing that session ID is not unique. So you may have different user pseudo IDs or client IDs in the past that have the same session ID. So again, for the property to create that unique identifier for each session, you'll have to combine the session ID with the user pseudo ID. So there's a couple more things that I have here on the slide. As I mentioned, there are estimates for the number of sessions that occurred on your website in the UI. There's also potentially use of that consent mode that will remove user pseudo ID, and there could be some modeling happening on the GA4 side. So if you're not seeing one-to-one match, again, nothing to worry about. You can, as long as you're very close within that percent or two, your BigQuery query is likely correct. So similar, now that we were accessing session ID, we can grab other event parameters. For the current session, the source information is actually stored within the event parameters. If you look at the traffic source in the schema, that will be the campaign medium and source of the first visit from that user. So it will be the acquisition source. Let's look at that in the schema too. So event parameters will hold the information about your current session's traffic source. And traffic source that you see here with name, medium, and source, that will have a campaign name, medium, and source of the first session, so the acquisition channel of the user. So if we're working with a user here that had their first session 6 months ago, name, medium, and source, even on this event currently, will be from about 6 months ago. So that could be very confusing when coming from GA3, and it's a common mistake that I've seen. So be very aware of that. If you look through the documentation as well, it'll describe it perfectly. So it'll let you know that it is an acquisition. And in the event parameters, you'll have medium source information from the current session. One interesting tidbit between GA3 and GA4, new medium or source in Google Analytics 3 or Universal Analytics would break a session and start a new session. In GA4, a new medium or a new source does not start a new session. It'll actually let that same session continue. It'll not count it twice. So you may have a single session with two mediums or with two sources. So let's write our query now. We just want to maybe look at number of sessions by a medium. So we already have a session identifier. And for each session identifier, let's now add in a similar way a medium. So the way we were grabbing the GA session ID from our event parameters, we can now grab the medium out of it. So we'll say key equals medium. And now instead of grabbing the integer value, we'll grab the string value. And let's call this one medium. And you can see now for each event, for each row, now we have a medium and a session ID. And you'll see that not every event within the session has a medium. So you also have to be very careful which event you're selecting. So if I add an event name just to kind of debug this, you'll see that session start and first visit. So those system created events do not include the medium in event parameters as a key. So we could just focus on page views, or for each session, we can grab the max medium, which would avoid the null, or however you want to approach it. Like I mentioned earlier, there's also option that there could be multiple mediums within one session. So we can just say here, let's say event name equals page view, and we'll run this. So it's not even present on every page view, and that makes sense because it's possible that we have a direct visit, and in that case, medium would be null. But let's grab this and say medium in session. So I'll add an alias to it so that we can access it and treat this as our view or a table. And we can say now select medium, and we'll count distinct session ID from our medium in session, and we need to group by medium, and let's order by number of sessions descending. So if I run this query, perfect. Now we can see the medium organic, 468 sessions on that day. Null, which would be direct, had 282, and so on. This is another where comparing to GA4 UI, you should get a pretty close match, but likely it won't be spot on. The order will probably be very similar. And I've also noticed in the medium, at least in our property, that CPC and PPC were treated the same in the UI, and we see them split here. So there could be slight nuances, but at high level, you should be able to see pretty similar or almost the same distribution of sessions. I'll open it up here. And yeah, we'll look at a takeaway of these simple sessions. So we looked into the Google Analytics for Schema. We looked at the system events and we used them in our query. We started retrieving basic metrics from our sessions. And importantly, we looked into how to flatten a repeated field, in our case, the event parameter. It looks like there was a very relevant question that came through. So the question was, will traffic source never be overwritten for the user, even if they have a different campaign source from a most recent session? So I believe, yes, that's correct. The traffic source value stays a value from the acquisition channel. And I'll try to navigate to that in the GA4 BigQuery schema. Let's see. So name of the traffic source that first acquired the user. This field is not populated in intraday tables. So yes, if it changes, this will stay consistent. It will always be from that initial visit. Good question. And let's dive into a few more advanced queries. So building user segments is a very common question that we get. And within BigQuery, you can go pretty crazy with it, especially compared to what the UI allows you. And I'll start very simple here. It's still probably advanced query compared to what we've done before, but in terms of segments, I'll do something very simple. So let's see how users are visiting our website today, or maybe this month. Out of those who visited our website for the first time in May. So if we want to find all the users that visited our website for the first time in May, we would just look at the user's pseudo ID, and we would say, give us May only. So I'm saying here, give me all the dates in May with a wildcard at the end. A more elegant way to do that would probably be to remove the table suffix, and then you can refer to it. And I could say table suffix is between May 1st, 2022 and May has 31 days, so we'll go to May 31st. And we want to see everyone who visited for the first time then, so we'll have a table suffix in our where clause, and we'll also say event name equals first visit. There we go, and we'll call this our segment, why not? And now we can use this segment in today's queries. So let's do everything in June. So I'll do 2022-06 to get all the data in June. And you can actually reference the table suffix in your as an attribute. You need to rename it. It will not allow you to have an underscore in your query. So I'll call this, let's say, GA date. And let's do count to see how many events we are getting. We can group by GA date. So if I run this, it's only going to let me know for each day in June how many events were triggered. And I'll order this by GA date. To make it more interesting now, I could say where user pseudo ID. So where our user was a user from the segment. So out of those users who visited for the first time in May, how are they triggering events in June? So what we would expect is that they're working and that they're visiting the website a lot more, maybe in those early days, and then slowly going away. If numbers are staying high, which at least in our case, it looks like they're staying pretty high, it means that we are keeping them interested in returning to our website. So on June 1st, there were 861 events from users who were first visited our website in May. And then, yeah, you can see we got a lot of weekends here. Weekends become very clear. So 18th and 19th, I'm going to assume were Saturday and Sunday. But users keep coming back to our website. So good news for adverb.com. If I took almost the same approach here when I did it before the call. So the queries are very similar. I actually didn't do it the elegant way here. So event name equals first visit. That's what defines the first visit. We could also say session number in the event parameters. If that equals 1, that would be the first time visitor as well. This is another pretty cool one that I want to go through. So one of the attributes that we had was the first touch, user first touch timestamp. So we can actually, for every event, see when the user first visited our website. And that's similar to the traffic source. That's going to let us know what the name, medium, and source were. But in this case, it gives us the time, the epoch time of when the user's first interaction with our website happened. And at the same time, we also have a timestamp of the current event. So one thing that we could do is, let's query this table. And for each event, what we can do is look at how far since our very first visit has it been? How long has it been since we visited for the first time, or since that user visited from the first time? So if we do event timestamp and we just subtract the first touch timestamp, this is going to give us the microseconds for every event since the user first visited. So a lot of these you can see here are zeros. That means it was just their very first event from that user. But let's do this. So instead of using and looking at it as just a microseconds on every event, we can group this for each user and maybe change it into the number of days. So we go from microseconds to milliseconds to seconds to minutes to hours to days. Perfect. So this is going to let us know how many days has it been since the first interaction. And then let's grab the user pseudo ID so that we'll group by that user. And let's grab the session number as well. And I'll just copy that from my slides because we've already written that together. So this was the GA session number. Before we were looking at GA session ID, but GA session number lets us know which visit from the user it is. It's stored in the event parameters, and it's another integer value. So if we group by 1 and 2 here, what we get is every user, we can see their session, and we can see how many days it is since their first visit. So this user visited us for the 8th time, and it has been 2.3 days since their initial visit. So after they discovered AdSwerve, it looks like every day they visit about 2 or 3 times. There's one here that's visited 430 times, and it's been 450 days since their first visit. So they almost visit every day. You can use that and make it a very interesting histogram almost, or maybe an overview of the averages. So let me do it like this. So I'll grab the session number so that we see if it's the first, second, or third visit of a user. And then I'll call this one days since first visit. And if we grab the average of this, now this can be a really useful metric to see how many days there are between the first and then the consecutive visits from our users. And maybe let's do it for the whole June. Our sample here is very small. So if we do a bigger sample, we should see a very nice growth. So the first session obviously happens the same day, and then usually 5 to 6 days later, we see the second session. 19 days later, we see the third. 29 days later, we see the fourth session of a user. So it's very interesting. It's probably a way for you to look, when can you expect your users to churn? So if someone doesn't come back by day 6, it's probably less likely that they'll come back at all, because on average, we see everyone to come back within the first 6 days. And then it looks like usually there's a bigger gap, and it takes them 19 days from the first time to come back for the, on their third session. So very useful metric, but overall, this was possible because of this attribute. And this was not available before. Now it's included. There's one more query that I want to go through, and I'll make sure I don't spend too much time on it so we have some time for QA. So each row in Google Analytics 4 export now, as we know, is an event. We have event timestamps associated with those, so we can see exactly the sequence in which events occur in our sessions. And we can use that to maybe build a funnel to see how that sequence of events leads to a conversion. So I'll help myself a little bit. I don't want to spend too much time writing it from scratch. And let's open a new one. So I'll have a base here, and my base is based on everything that we've written already. So we're looking at the, let me go. We're grabbing the user pseudo ID, event timestamp. We're creating a session ID and page path, and we're only looking at page views. So we want to see how page views lead to a conversion. Now, I'll still write from scratch the difficult part. So if we just select from base, and I got to remove this comma here at the end. We get every user, we get the timestamp of the page view, and we get the page path of where that page view occurred. So we're interested now in grabbing the previous page path. So we want to see what led someone to that page path. So to create that, we'll use windows and analytic functions. So we can say lag page path by 1, and we'll say partition. So create a window, only look within a specific session. And like I said, a session is defined by a user pseudo ID and the GA session ID event parameter. So we'll partition by that, and we need to make sure to order by event timestamp. Now for every page path that we get, along with it in the same row, we'll also get a previous page path. So we have a page path here, and we can see what the previous page path it was. So if previous page path is null, that just means that it was the entry page. So where user first got to our website. So a couple of these that are blogs, they probably found us on Google, landed on this page. The second one, it looks like it was another blog article, but that blog article led to a new blog article. But in our case, let's say we want to focus and only see the page paths that led to contact us. So let's give this one a name, previous page. And then now we'll select everything from previous page. And to see what led to contact us, we'll say where the current page is contact us. So page path ends with contact us, and I believe we have a slash at the end. And what we can do now is, let's just grab previous page, and let's call this one previous page query. We don't want to use the same name for the, its previous page path anyways. And let's just count and see. This is events, and we'll have to group by the first one and order by the second one. Let's do descending. So we'll now see what was the most common page path that led to our conversion. So most of the time, our users came to contact us directly. That happened 105 times. And then the second most popular was coming to our contact us from the homepage, from our team. Interestingly, from contact us, those were probably 23 refreshes. To make it even better or more readable, we could look at how many events occurred, so we can do a distinct and do a concatenation again of user pseudo ID and session ID. So user pseudo ID, session ID, and we can say that's a conversion. Basically, if within a session someone gets to contact us, that's a conversion. So we got all the conversions, but what led to those conversions? And you can see coming from a directly or from an outside page that's not part of the AdSwerve, every event, every visit was of course a session as well. Whereas from internal ones, it could happen multiple times. So we had 86 sessions that converted, but came from adswerve.com. And I'll open these two as well, so that when we share, those are available. Quick overview of what we can take away from these more advanced queries. So we learned how to build segments. Basically, use user pseudo ID, it's your friend, and then use it in the work clause, or you can create a inner join or left join, however you want to treat that segment. The second is the first touch timestamp that's included. It can be very beneficial. It's a field that did not exist in Google Analytics 3, and in this case, it lets us know when did the user first interact with our website, even if we're only looking at today's event. And then the third one, we're building user funnels. We were using this function right here. So lag, we used an analytic function lag over a window for the session. So we're looking at user pseudo ID and session ID. If we removed session ID from here, for example, our funnel would now be open to the user and not just closed for the session. Some high level things maybe at the end as well about AdSwerve. So we work, as Marie mentioned, with helping our clients adopt Google Analytics 4. Very important reminder there at the top right. So we're a year and 2 days away from Universal Analytics going away on standard properties. Generally, what we recommend is onboarding, setting up Google Analytics 4 as quickly as possible, and then definitely running both in parallel for a while. Running it in parallel will help you, let's see, those differences that may happen because of different tracking. Session numbers may be a little different. Maybe you're now tracking a little more of a certain event than you were before. So you got to make sure that you're aware of the differences, but at the same time, try to get those numbers as close as possible. Realize if maybe you're missing something on the collection side. And then before July 1st of 2023, or a little later, I believe, on premium properties or GA360 properties, you need to make sure that you're switched and that you are relying on GA4. And there's a lot of resources available on our website already. As I mentioned, Charles and I did a webinar that dives into that first section quite a bit more about a year ago. That's available on our website. There are quite a few blog posts that are describing, in this case, the sunset. There are also some blog posts already about writing BigQueries. I'm pretty sure I'll turn the queries that I was demoing today into blog posts with a little more explanation. And we also have an ebook that's a GA4 guide that you can download from our website as well. And I believe we can go to questions and answers. Hopefully our team has been able to answer quite a few on the fly. Marie, would you mind helping me? And maybe we can find some of those that haven't been answered yet, or if any should deserve a shout out.
Yeah, I think there was some actually queued up already in the question box.
Okay.
Let me know if you're not able.
Yeah, I'll just select a few random ones. So there's quite a few. So if a user clears the cookies, will they get a new pseudo ID? In other words, will their full consumer journey become somewhat inaccurate? Yeah, that's completely correct. So that user pseudo ID is based on a cookie, at least on the web properties, it's the _GA cookie. So if cookies are cleared, or if you start using a new browser, if you go to a different device, you'll be seen as a new user in the eyes of Google Analytics. You have an option of setting a user ID. So if you saw we had a user pseudo ID and a user ID. User ID is something that can be set with your rules. So if you have a login system, or if you're identifying users somewhat differently, you could be sending that value as well, and then rely on the user pseudo ID. That's been a useful webinar. Thank you. What are your biggest challenges with the GA4 data set? By Sebastian. I think what's been is this different scope. So going from something that was session scope to now event scope. And then some of the dimensions that we saw before are not available now. And how to access them. Like you saw, it was very easy to count the number of new users before, because it was a totals.new visits metric or a dimension. Whereas now you have to grab that from the event parameters. You cannot just sum it up. You have to make sure that you're only counting it once per each user, or you do have, a first visit event name. So you got to be careful. It's not just copy paste or and change the table. That scoping difference is the biggest thing that I felt like I've had to adapt. And then just going to GA4 data or to BigQuery from something like a traditional MySQL, then definitely any unnesting, flattening that we were using, that's the learning curve. Once you learn that, it's pretty, I would say it's pretty straightforward. In UA, I believe we're limited to one view per domain property in BigQuery. Yeah, that's correct. So in Universal Analytics, you are allowed to export one view for every property. How does that work in GA? Can we keep our existing BigQuery data import and link to the same domain with GA4? I hope it makes sense. That was asked by Chris. So you can, I hope I understand it correctly. You can use the same project in Google Cloud Platform for your exports. You can have GA3 and GA4 properties together. And then when it comes to the same domain, yeah, if your website has GA3 and GA4, both can be flowing from Google Analytics into BigQuery. And here you're limited to, GA4 doesn't really have views, so the export is set up on a property, but it does allow you to limit to specific data streams. Okay, I believe we're at time. Marie, I could address a couple more questions here. I see they're coming in. What do you think?
Why don't you go ahead and if you have time, and if people want to stay on a minute or two longer, if you want to take a few more, I think that's good.
Okay, sounds good. So there was a more high-level question from Ben. I'm curious what some of the common reasons are the companies use BigQuery plus GA4. I demonstrated some useful queries. Can you elaborate on some of the use cases for BigQuery? I can see this useful in conjunction with CRM. Definitely, that last piece that you mentioned, adding any of your data and joining it with Google Analytics data can be extremely powerful. Because, for example, Google Analytics does not allow PII. You cannot identify users. And also in your CRM, you can have additional information about those users. And joining that together, it can be extremely powerful. It can also be very powerful to have data from offline transactions from your users, and on the other hand, online behavior. Because now you can, for example, see that maybe they're looking at your products online, but buying them offline, and you're not giving credit to your sources potentially because you think, oh, they're not converting. But now joining it, you can see, okay, they are converting, and I'm putting everything together. BigQuery also has great ML capabilities. So you can take your users and maybe your new users and start predicting their lifetime value based on all the data that you have. It's also the way to own your data. So let's say that you want to make sure that all the events and everything is collected, is stored somewhere. You'll have to export that data to BigQuery first, and from there maybe into some sort of your archival storages. When it comes to other use cases, I often say is whenever you get frustrated and you can't do something in UI, you'll probably want to switch to BigQuery because you can do it there. And then, yeah, our clients have ideas that go all over. So in a lot of cases, GA4 UI gets limited pretty quickly. I know that in Google Analytics 3, segments, for example, had time limitations. You could only go back something like 3 months, and then in Google Analytics BigQuery export, you could go back as far as you wanted to. Do you have any theories as to why GA4 kept nesting? Is it because we can add as many custom parameters as we want? Yeah. You answered your question there. So nesting is not a bad thing. It's different. So when you work with BigQuery, it's not a traditional database. It's not a relational database. It's analytical database, and having everything together allows you to write queries way more efficiently because you don't have to join everything, and it can be redundant. The storage is so cheap in BigQuery. It's like $0.01 per gigabyte. Then having an extra few rows or extra few columns doesn't really matter. So nesting is not a bad thing, and the reason why they took advantage of it in this case is because, like you said, you can have multiple event parameters per each event. Then you can have multiple user parameters per each event or each user, and then there can be multiple items for each event. And if you remember, where was it? This slide, yeah, I was showing we had event, and then those things that can happen multiple times are then shown, are then nested here. Then there was a question, does consent mode apply to custom dimensions? So there was a very good article on our website that was written by Ruslan on our team, and it looks into what all comes through with consent mode. And I believe user pseudo ID gets blanked. I think any custom event parameters that you're sending will still come through. Let me try to find that article. I got it right here. So if we, there's a good overview, but in GA4, if privacy is denied, if that consent mode is denied, you don't see any data in the intraday, but in daily, it looks like all hits still come through, but you do not see the user pseudo ID. So you cannot basically identify a user behind those hits. Yeah, that would be a loophole then if you were identifying them with event parameters. So on your end, you would have to take care of that. I believe I've addressed most of them, and hopefully our team's been answering the questions as well. I hope this was useful for everyone, and we'll organize a few more in the future.
Thanks, everyone. This concludes our webinar, and we will be in touch with the webinar recording via email to all attendees. We'll also be posting it to our website, so be on the lookout for that soon. Thanks a lot, and have a great rest of your day.